Well, hey, New Day. So good that you are joining me this week online, and I'm so excited that at least some of you will be joining me next week, not only online, but also right here in person. I'm standing right now in our auditorium, which is set up in a way that's going to be conducive to your safety and mine, and it's just going to be great to begin, starting next week, the long journey back to some sense of normalcy. Can't wait. Okay, that's next week. Today, we're continuing our series, The Pursuit of Fulfillment. Today is week 3. Last week, we covered the second half of chapter 1, and today, we're going to cover the first half of chapter 2. So our biblical text today is Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. By way of introduction into our text today, let me say this. My all-time favorite actor in the whole world, hands down, by far, is Steve Martin. Steve Martin. He has many, many, many funny movies, okay? The Three Amigos, Father of the Bride, Cheaper by the Dozen, Roxanne, just to name a few, okay? The list goes on and on. But my all-time favorite work of Steve Martin is his work in the Pink Panther movies. For all those of you who have seen these movies, would you like to buy a hamburger? Okay, all right, that's terrible. I can't do Steve, but if you've seen the movies, you love me even more. If you haven't seen the movies, you're really questioning whether or not I should be your pastor, okay? I totally understand. But my point is this, Steve Martin is comedic genius. Because I've been such a big fan of his acting, when a pastor friend of mine recommended his autobiography entitled Born Standing Up, I ordered the book, and let me tell you, I could not put it down. I want to read you an excerpt from the book because I think it nicely sets the stage for the passage in the scriptures that we're going to study today, again, which is Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. Martin writes about the peak of his career as a stand-up comic, okay? Today we know him for his work in movies, but he got his start doing stand-up comedy. And here, this excerpt describes the peak of his stand-up career. Martin writes this: 60 cities in 63 days, 72 cities in 80 days, 85 cities in 90 days. The Coliseum in Richfield, Ohio, largest audience in one day, 18,695. The Chicago International Amphitheater, 29,000 people. Stealth limousines and subterranean entrances. I played Nassau Coliseum, New York. How many tickets sold? 45,000. I was astonished that popular culture had fixed its attention on my little act. This lightning strike was happening to me, Stephen Glenn Martin, who had started from zero, from a magic act, from juggling in my backyard. And now I was the biggest concert comedian in show business ever. I was elated. My success had outstripped my wildest aspirations. I had hit a gusher, and I stopped checking prices in restaurants, hotels, and clothing stores. I bought my first house, and then I bought my second. Now, you're probably not at all surprised to hear about Steve Martin's elation over his success and the personal fortune that followed. But you might be very surprised by what comes next in Martin's autobiography. He says, though the audiences continued to grow, I experienced a concomitant depression caused by exhaustion, isolation, and creative ennui. Now, ennui is an interesting choice of words. The word is used to describe someone who is both discontent and bored. Martin explains, as I was too famous to go outdoors, without a discomforting hoopla, my romantic interlude ceased because I had no longer access to civilized life. The hour and a half I spent performing was still fun, but there were no band members, no others on stage, and after the show, I took a solitary ride back to the hotel where I was speedily escorted by security across the lobby. A key went in a door, and boom, the blunt interior of a hotel room. Nowhere to look but inward. And take a look at what he says. This was, as the cliche goes, the loneliest period in my life. If you were to read Steve Martin's autobiography for yourself, what you would learn in sum is this. His life was full of achievements. His bank account was full of money. His life was full of pleasures, yet he himself was empty. None of it satisfied. In the end, it left him lonely, bored, and depressed. 3 words that you would not think to use to describe a comedian. If you're joining us for the first time today, the book of Ecclesiastes that we're studying in this series could rightly be called Solomon's autobiography. We just looked at Steve Martin's autobiography, but our biblical text today comes from Solomon's autobiography, which he wrote after a 20-year-long failed experiment where he tried to find lasting fulfillment and satisfaction in this life apart from God. We pick up today in chapter 2, where Solomon's going to share with us some of the specific things that he tried to find lasting fulfillment in. And as we work our way through the text, I think you'll be quite surprised to see the parallels between Solomon's life and Steve Martin's. Let's jump into our text. The first thing we see today in verses 1 to 2 is this: Solomon's mission. Solomon's mission. In our text today, Solomon sets out on a mission. Better said, he records in the text about the period in his life when he set out on a mission. Here's the backstory. After King David died, who was Solomon's father, Solomon became king. And the Bible tells us that for the first 20 years of his reign, Solomon's heart was devoted to the Lord. But 20 years into his reign as king, because Solomon just foolishly refused to follow the rules that God had set forth for a king to follow, because Solomon ignored those rules, his heart was led astray. Today we would say Solomon began backsliding in his fear of the Lord. And during this next 20-year period of his life and his reign, Solomon set out on a mission to see if he could find anything in life worth pursuing apart from God. He set out to find if there was anything that he could pursue in this life apart from God that could provide him with lasting satisfaction and fulfillment. This was his mission. And friends, this mission is what Solomon is describing for us in chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. Take a look. He says this: I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. So this here we have the record of Solomon's mission. He was to test and to see if he could find happiness in life apart from God. So that's the first thing we see in our text in verses 1 to 2, Solomon's mission. Moving on. The next thing we see in our text in verses 4 to 9 is Solomon's myselfs. Solomon's myselfs. I don't know what translation of the Bible you typically read, but in Hebrew, the language that the book of Ecclesiastes was originally written in, the phrase "for myself" occurs 9 times between verses 4 and 9. Here, Solomon is listing the various ways that he tried to make himself happy apart from God. Let me try to walk you through these verses one at a time, kind of paint the picture for you. Solomon says in verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. The largest private house in the U.S., take a look, is the Biltmore Estate, built in the 1890s by 26-year-old George Washington Vanderbilt, grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, the famous New York Railroad tycoon. With virtually unlimited resources at his disposal, Vanderbilt's 175,000 square foot estate took more than 6 years to build and was such a massive undertaking that it required its own brick-making factory and its own private railway for delivering materials. The finished 250-room mansion has 34 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms, and George filled it with priceless art and antiques. To ensure the grounds that surrounded the mansion were beautiful, George hired the best of the best, Frederick Olmsted, the landscape architect who created New York's Central Park. Beautiful and extensive gardens were created around the house, and the 125,000 acres that the home sat upon were groomed to be ideal hunting grounds for George. He had foresters to tend the forest to make it the ideal grounds for hunting. Pretty impressive stuff, right? Well, let me tell you, as impressive as this house is on its own, I need you to understand something. The Biltmore Estate, compared to Solomon's private residence, is nothing more than a shed in your backyard to hold your lawnmower and your gardening tools. The Biltmore only took 6 years to build. Solomon's private residence took 13 years to build. And this is why our text says, take a look, Solomon says that he undertook great projects. Indeed. And it says he built numerous houses on this scale, which is the crazy thing. It wasn't just the one house. Solomon built houses for himself. We learn from 1 Kings that Solomon devoted 13 years to building the king's house. Then he built the house of the forest of Lebanon, and then he went on to build a house for his wife, who was the daughter of the king of Egypt. Biltmore? In Solomon's kingdom, Biltmore would have only been worthy for his cooks and his servants to quarter in. Now, like George Vanderbilt, Solomon hired the best landscape architects to surround his many enormous homes with beautiful vineyards and gardens and orchards. Take a look, verses 4-5. Solomon says, I planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. Solomon knew that a home that wasn't surrounded with beautiful grounds wouldn't be nearly as beautiful, and so he made sure that surrounding his magnificent properties, there were gardens for vegetables, there were orchards for fruit, and there were vineyards for making wine from. And Solomon made sure that his gardens and his vineyards and his orchards were meticulously landscaped to complement and accentuate the beauty of his many homes. Now, what's a huge home without a bunch of servants to do all the work, right? I mean, if you think George Washington Vanderbilt was personally vacuuming his 175,000 square foot home, and if you think he was personally mowing his 125,000 acres, you would be mistaken, okay? He had about 40 servants who just worked there full time to keep everything going. Well, let me tell you, Solomon had his servants too. Take a look. The beginning of verse 7. Solomon says, I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. So apparently the male and female servants paired up and had kids, and those kids would grow up to become servants themselves. Moving on, Solomon says in the second part of verse 7, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were before me in Jerusalem. He had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before him. Now, herds here refers to large animals like cattle and oxen, and flocks here refers to small animals like sheep and goats. And Solomon possessed huge quantities of each. which he needed to feed his 30 to 40,000 servants that kept up his household. Biltmore estate, 40 servants. Solomon's estate, about 40,000 servants. You say, Mike, where'd you come up with that number? Well, take a look at 1 Kings chapter 4. It says, the daily food requirements for Solomon's palace were 150 bushels of choice flour and 300 bushels of meal. Also 10 oxen from the fattening pens, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep or goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roe deer, and choice poultry. Friends, scholars have taken this amount of food, they've taken into account how much the average person eats, and then they've calculated that this amount of food would have been able to feed between 30 to 40,000 servants. You get in the picture? Biltmore, 6 years. Solomon's private residence, 13 years. Biltmore's servants, 40. Solomon's servants, closer to 40,000. This was opulence to the nth degree. Now, I want to remind you that commoners in Solomon's day subsisted on grains and fruits and vegetables, and they actually ate very little meat. Oh, they had meat animals, but they used them for work, they used them for milk, they used them for wool, so they actually ate very little meat. Meat was a luxury for the wealthy 3,000 years ago in Solomon's day. But Solomon was so rich that he had meat on the menu every single day, 365 days a year, even for his servants, all 30,000+ of them. Okay, moving on. The question begs, what do you do with a home as big as Solomon's? Well, you make it a part-time job just to fill it with priceless treasures. That's what George Vanderbilt did with his 175,000 square foot mansion, and Solomon did the same with his mansion, which was even larger. Solomon says this in the first part of verse 8, I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. Now, the phrase special treasures here, it's just a general term. It's an inclusive term, and it just speaks to wealth of any kind. And these treasures that Solomon filled his home with likely came as gifts from those who came to seek his wisdom from all around the world. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 2, Solomon says that the Queen of Sheba arrived in Jerusalem with a great caravan of camels loaded down with spices, with gold, and with precious jewels. And this is what it was like for everyone who came to visit Solomon. They came sharing the special treasures of the land from which they came. Besides these gifts, 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 22 says that the king also had merchant ships at sea that returned every 3 years, bringing gold and silver and ivory and apes and monkeys. And 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 11 says that these ships also brought large quantities of rare wood and precious stones. And Solomon took all these special treasures and he filled his many large homes with them. He used them as decorations and adornments to further accentuate the beauty of his already magnificent home. But friends, Solomon's decadence is just warming up. As we continue moving through our text and now arrive at the second part of verse 8, Solomon says this. He says, I acquired male and female singers. Now, this verse is completely lost on us who live in the 21st century. It would have meant something to those who lived 3,000 years ago, but to us, it's just lost. Why? Because we live in the age of the smartphone, okay, that holds tens of thousands of songs on them, and then they fit in our pocket, okay? This verse is lost on us because we live in the age of Pandora and iTunes and Amazon Music and Spotify and all these other services that allow us to listen to to our favorite genre of music as well as all our favorite songs within that specific genre. Today, you can't go into a restaurant, you can't go into an elevator, you can't go into a store without hearing the most popular bands throughout the country, okay, that we all enjoy listening to, or at least some of us, okay? But in Solomon's day, music was rare. One commentator I read said this: singers to provide music must have been deemed one of the rarest pleasures that a royal court could afford. And friends, it wasn't just an a cappella choir like pentatonics, okay? 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 12 says that Solomon used the rare wood that he got from his merchant ships that came back every 3 years to make various musical instruments to accompany the singers. We learn from 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32, that Solomon composed 3,000 proverbs as well as, it says, 1,005 songs. So every time Solomon wrote a new hit, okay, he had professional musicians and professional singers to help bring that hit to life. Today, we all live like Solomon in terms of having access to great music, but to appreciate what's being written here, we have to understand that this was 3,000 years ago when a singing band, as we would call it today, would be performing. That was just incredibly rare. But that's what Solomon had every day of his kingship. As if this wasn't enough, Solomon says in the last part of verse 8, I acquired a harem as well, the delights of the heart of man. Now, the word delights here has an erotic meaning of sexual pleasure, as it does in Song of Solomon chapter 7, verse 6. Some translators translate this passage to read, I acquired for myself many beautiful concubines. We read in 1 Kings chapter 11, now Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. He had 700 wives of royal birth, as well as 300 concubines. Now, in case you're new to the Bible and you don't know what a concubine is, it's real simple. In ancient culture, if a man's wife was barren, it was ancient practice to go ahead and provide the husband with a concubine. She was basically a second-class additional wife. That was a common reason that people took upon concubines, but another common reason was just so that the husband could have multiple sexual partners. And that's precisely the case here. In addition to his 700 wives of royal birth, Solomon amassed 300 concubines. I once heard renowned Bible expositor Chuck Swindoll say of Solomon's concubines that they were available to him any time of the day and night in any number he wished for whatever desire he had. Practically speaking, what this means is that the late Hugh Hefner had absolutely nothing on Solomon. I mean, Hugh Hefner compared to Solomon was practically chaste, okay? And of course, I'm being facetious here, but I think you get the idea. Now understand this, because of Solomon's great wealth and the opulent lifestyle that it provided him with, Solomon's fame spread. Look with me at verse 9, where Solomon says, I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. Last week in chapter 1, Solomon's fame spread because of his great wisdom, his exceedingly great wisdom that God had bestowed upon Solomon. Well, here in chapter 2, Solomon's fame continues to spread because of his opulent wealth and extravagant lifestyle. This was lifestyles of the rich and famous, okay? This was MTV's Cribs. Word got out about all his wealth and all the luxuries it provided, and his fame continued to spread. So friends, do you see why I entitled verses 4 to 9 Solomon's Myselfs? In these verses, Solomon says, I built myself houses. I planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens. I made myself orchards. I made myself irrigation systems to water my gardens and orchards and vineyards. I gathered for myself silver and gold and special treasures. I gathered for myself servants. I gathered for myself singers. And finally, I gathered for myself many beautiful concubines. Friends, Solomon's mission was to test and to investigate whether or not he could find lasting fulfillment in life apart from God. And his various myself statements reveal the many things that he tried to find lasting fulfillment and satisfaction and happiness in. So get the picture. Solomon built himself huge homes. He surrounded them with beautiful gardens and vineyards and orchards. He staffed his homes with servants. He filled the tables in his homes with only the choicest foods from his herds and flocks and only the finest wine from his many vineyards. He decorated his home with special treasures from around the world. And he saw to it that only the most skilled musicians and singers in all the kingdom filled the air of his homes with beautiful music that he himself had written. And then he stocked his homes full of beautiful women who existed solely to fulfill any and every sexual desire that he might have. Friend, Solomon was the ultimate hedonist as he tested these various things to see if any could satisfy. And take a look. Our text tells us that all the while, his mind guided him with wisdom. Verse 3. He says, in all of his experiments, his wisdom stayed with him. Verse 9. What he's saying is this: even though I was indulging myself, not for the good of the kingdom, but for my own selfish reasons, my God-given wisdom stayed with me so that I could scientifically investigate and test whether or not any of the things that I was giving myself to could provide me with that which I was looking for, which was lasting fulfillment. This leads us nicely to our third and final thing that we see in our text today. First, we saw Solomon's mission. Second, we saw Solomon's myselfs. And now finally, we see Solomon's misery. Spoiler alert, Solomon didn't find what he was looking for. Like Steve Martin, who found himself depressed and discontent despite his fame and fortune and all the things that it could buy, at the end of his journey, Solomon didn't find bliss, rather misery. Take a look. After trying so many things, all except God, to make him happy, here's what Solomon said of his pursuit of pleasure. Verses 1 to 2. But surely this also is vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? Back in chapter 1, he had just said in general terms that none of our pursuits apart from God can provide us with any lasting fulfillment. Well, now here in chapter 2, he gives specific examples of the kinds of things that he himself, as well as people in general, turn to look for lasting happiness in life. But he lets us know that in the end, all of his pursuits left him empty, not happy. Now, I do want to point out something that's very important. Okay? The things Solomon pursued, though they didn't provide lasting happiness, they did provide him with fleeting pleasures. And that's what Solomon's getting at in verse 10, where he says, whatever my eyes desired, I didn't keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. What he's saying is this: it was fun to pursue the acquisition of all the things I just mentioned. The big home, the luxurious lifestyle, and the women. The reason it was fun is because as I pursued these things, I lived with the hope that once I had them, then I would be happy. So he's saying the pursuit was actually really fun and exciting. But after 13 years, The home was finally finished. The gardens and vineyards and orchards were fully functional and mature. The staff and singers and sexual partners were moved in. The finest foods and wines were served at every meal, and wonderful music filled the air, creating a lovely ambiance all the time. But Solomon's saying, once I had it all, far from making me happy, it left me empty, bored, and depressed. Solomon's saying, I was at the height of my career, just like Steve Martin. But it was here that I realized that having all these things, it just wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Solomon's saying all these things overpromised and under-delivered. They lured him in, promising lasting fulfillment and satisfaction, and he did not find that in any of these things. Solomon says it this way in verse 11. I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all of it was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. Solomon said, even in all these things, I did not find the fulfillment I was looking for. He's saying in the same way that you can't reach out and grasp the wind, he said, you can't reach out and grab hold of happiness through any of these means. He says there's no profit under the sun, which harkens back to chapter 1, verse 3. In chapter 1, verse 3, Solomon posed this question to his audience. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? In other words, he's asking, is there any pursuit we could give ourselves to in this life that could provide us with lasting happiness and fulfillment apart from God? And now here in chapter 2, verse 11, Solomon finally answers this question that he's posed back in chapter 1, verse 3. And he says the resounding answer is no. Can these things provide fleeting pleasures? Absolutely. But can they provide lasting happiness? Absolutely not. Like Steve Martin, Solomon's life was full of achievements. Solomon's bank was full of money. Solomon's life was full of pleasure. And Solomon himself was absolutely empty. So we see Solomon's misery. In the end, all his pursuits left him lonely, bored, and depressed. Solomon's mission and his myselfs only led to his misery. Now, friends, let's do a little soul searching together before we close in prayer so that Solomon's misery doesn't become our own. The sad truth is, most Americans are pursuing Solomon's lifestyle. Okay, that's basically what we call today the American dream. For many of you, and I admit, sometimes myself included, can get sucked into this as we listen to Solomon's opulent lifestyle, as we listen to the beautiful home that George Washington Vanderbilt built for himself, as we hear of all the things that Steve Martin's success could buy him, we become envious of these people. And even for those of us who are committed followers of Jesus, if we were honest, there's a part of us that actually believes on the inside, yeah, I know what the Bible says, and that's all great and fine. But man, if I can just get a hold of those things, this would make me happy. Solomon says, you're wrong. It won't. Far from leaving you satisfied, when you get the things that you pursue, far from satisfying, they actually only create in you an insatiable appetite for even more. This is why Solomon, after building the first home, went and built the palace in the forest of Lebanon. And after that one, went and built another one. This is why after getting the first wife, Solomon went and got a second, and then a third, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, and then a 700th, and then 1,000. It's the pursuit of these things that's fun and exciting, but once we acquire that which we pursue, we're not happy. We finally get into that home and then we go, you know what would be cool though? If I could just get this, but like a brick version of this. We say, if I could just get that raise, oh my goodness, if my income could only increase this much, then I would be happy. But as soon as we get to that place, we go, And if now I only had this much more, then I would be happy. It's exciting and fun to pursue. But once we achieve, we find, like Solomon, that it leaves us empty and only wanting more. Friend, God loves you, and He doesn't want you singing the Rolling Stones, "I can't get no satisfaction," or U2's "I still haven't found what I'm looking for the rest of your life." So He's seen to it today that you've heard this message from Solomon that's so vitally important. And friends, you've got to decide if you really believe Solomon's message is true or not. For me, I'm absolutely convinced that it is. I've read enough biographies like Steve Martin to know that success and fame and fortune do not truly satisfy. And I love that this testimony comes from people who are not Christians. When they finally get honest and write autobiographies and share the truth, they're saying, "It all left me empty." From my perspective, Solomon's declaration here in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 to 11, it corresponds to reality from my perspective. Maybe you've seen in the news the last couple of weeks how Elon Musk is divesting himself of all his many opulent mansions and divesting himself of all his worldly possessions. I don't know the details of his story or his motivation, but I'm guessing that he's discovered what Solomon's been saying for 3,000 years. It just leaves you empty. And if it doesn't deliver the happiness that it's supposed to provide, then why in the world hang on to it? Speaking of billionaires, I find it curious how so many billionaires from around the world nowadays are getting into space exploration. Have you noticed this? How billionaires around the world have started space programs? You have South African billionaire Elon Musk. You have American billionaire Jeff Bezos. You have British billionaire Richard Branson. And finally, you have Russian billionaire Yuri Milner. All these guys have started space programs. You see, when you have it all, and you still haven't found what you're looking for under the sun, you need to start exploring for it up in space. Sadly, they're going to be just as disappointed up in space as they have been down here on earth because, as Solomon put it, there is no lasting satisfaction or profit apart from God. Friends, Jesus said it this way in Luke chapter 12, verse 15. One's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Solomon had all the abundance anyone could ever want, and it didn't make him happy. And it won't make you happy or me happy either. The things of this world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, they can only offer fleeting pleasures. They temporarily tickle. They temporarily excite. They're temporarily fun. But in the end, they far from satisfy us. They actually create within us an insatiable hunger for more. Pursuing these things, it's like eating a potato chip. You can't have just one. That salty one potato chip just creates in you a hunger for even more. So it is with the things in this world that we pursue apart from God to find happiness. A relationship with God, on the other hand, truly satisfies. And the good news that I came to share with you today is that this relationship with God is made possible because of Jesus. Jesus died on the cross in your place and for your sins, and mine as well, so that we can make peace with God and find the lasting satisfaction we're all looking for. And you have a choice today. You can learn from Solomon's folly, or you can repeat it. I want to invite all who by faith are going to trust that God knows best and are going to trust that God used Solomon to send this message to us so that we don't waste a big chunk of our life pursuing for something that doesn't exist. apart from God? I want to invite you to join me in our closing prayer. Right where you are, if you can do so, would you bow your head? Would you close your eyes? And not out loud, but would you say something along these lines to God in your heart? Say, Heavenly Father, it's so easy to get sucked into culture. It's so easy to just kind of go with the flow and to have culture influence me instead of me influencing culture. And God, I readily admit today that my heart, it desires Solomon's lifestyle. It desires Steve Martin's lifestyle. It desires to live in the kind of home that Vanderbilt lived in. God, I'm drawn to that. God, I'm asking for your help today to see through the smoke and mirrors, to see underneath the surface that these things do not satisfy apart from you. God, help me to see and understand today that apart from you, I'll never find the satisfaction that I'm looking for. So God, help me today to turn from pursuing the acquisition of these things. Help me to turn from that. And God, help me to turn towards deepening my relationship with you. God, I believe today by faith that it's you that I'm looking for. Now, God, Jesus tells us that life does not consist in the abundance of our possessions. God, I'm believing by faith that what Jesus says is true. And God, I'm also believing by faith today for Jesus to forgive me of my sins so that I can have peace with you. And you can provide me with the lasting fulfillment that's only found in you. God, thank you for the gift of forgiveness of sins. And God, thank you for the gift of lasting satisfaction found only in you. I'm thankful, God, and I pray this all in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. To learn more about our church, visit newdaychurch.cc. If you've been blessed by what you've learned and would like to support our ministry, you can give a one-time or reoccurring gift online at newdaychurch.cc/giving.